Hi class, welcome to week 3. We're ready to take a look at chapter 3, and chapter 3 has to do with if statements or selection statements. So I've loaded a special instructor PowerPoint on Canvas. I'm going to download that. And we'll take a look. And you can either download it or just look at it online in Canvas. Either one is fine. When we're talking about, I have updates available, yay. When we're talking about selection statements, we're just talking about if statements. And selection statements is the terminology used because when we use an if statement, we are selecting which code to be executed. And from our old flowchart days, you know that the if condition is always shown within a diamond, a decision diamond, and it usually has a true and a false path coming off of it. And what we're concerned about when we're working with if statements is the condition of our if statement, because that's how we can be exactly specific on which data we want to process. Now, when we're working with our test condition, our condition is always going to result in a Boolean value. It's either going to be evaluated to true or evaluated to false. And in order to create these comparison conditions, we usually use a relational operator. And of course, we have the standard relational operators when we're working with Java. Is less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, and not equal. When we're creating our test condition, remember it's super important that we always have two sides to our condition. We have to say if A equals B. We can't say if A equals B or C or D, because then we only have one side to part of those conditions. We always have to have two sides. When we're working with our condition, the operands, the either side, can be a variable, or they could be literal strings, like a string or a number. And here's a flowchart that shows the evaluation of an if statement. And we're saying if our row number is an integer, and we're going to assign a row number a value of 2. And in a flowchart, we could say if that row number is equal to, we want to write out a message, everybody in row number 2, please stand. Otherwise, we just want to write out a message that says thank you. And we want to write out that thank you message after our number 2 row stands. Now, this code is not really shown in Java. It's more of a pseudocode. So let's look at some specific things before we get too worried about Java. First of all, if we have an if statement and we say if row number equals 2, is that the same as saying if 2 equals the row number? Would we have the same results? In this case, we would. We'd have an equality issue. We could also have a less than condition. So we could use our less than relational operator. And again, here our condition is shown in green, and our flowchart shows a visual representation of how we're going to process this selection statement. If our row number is actually less than 2, then we're going to write out this message. Otherwise, we won't write out that message. That code will not be selected to execute if that condition is not true. Now, in this case, our order of operands does matter, right? Because we're using a less than condition. So we say if row number is less than 2, is that the same as if 2 is less than the row number? They don't have the same result. So we have to be careful when we're putting our operands in our condition. Make sure that we're getting things in the condition in the way that we want. In this example, we have a greater than condition. And again, our if statement checks to see if the row number is greater than 2, and if that condition is true, we write out a message. Now, when we're working with Java, we would have our code a little bit different. We would declare our integer and assign it a specific value. Oops, it's missing a semicolon. And then in our if statement, we're going to be using lowercase, and the keyword is if, and our condition must be enclosed within parentheses. Then after our condition is complete, we're going to have an open curly brace, and then we'll have all of the lines of code that we're going to refer to as the body of our if statement, the lines of code that are going to execute if this if statement is true. And then we'll close our curly brace, our bracket, when we're done with all of our lines of code. All of our code that is part of the if statement body will be indented so that it can be easy for others to see that this code is part of our if statement. In this case, we go ahead and write out the message that says thank you. So that message will occur whether or not we execute the body of our if statement. Now notice in the body of our if statement, we're doing an extra print line with just a space so we could get a blank line of output. Now when we use flowchart conventions, remember that sometimes it can be helpful to scratch out a flowchart and get your thoughts down on how you want your logic to work. And when we're working with a flowchart, we use the decision diamond, and we always have a true and a false, and the directions of our arrows become very important because in order to convey the information, the logic of this flowchart, we need those arrows to be going in the right direction. All right, so working with if statements. We have a single alternative selection. That's an if statement. We have if, and then the condition enclosed within parentheses. And if we only have one line of code in the body of our if statement, we do not need the opening and closing braces. But if we have more than one line of code, we need those brackets. And a lot of people will go ahead and include them because they know that the chances are they may later come along and add another line of code. And if the braces or curly brackets are already there, it makes things easier. Now, a dual alternative selection is where we add an all else clause. So here we're saying if some condition is true, I want to execute all of the lines of code that are within the curly braces that follow my if statement. Otherwise, my else statement, if this condition is not true, then I want to execute all of the lines of code that are in my else body. So they are associated with my else clause and the opening and closing curly braces of the else. Now in this example, we're using a Boolean variable, and we've declared a bool named brown hair, and we're going to ask each person to set that to true or false. And then in our if statement, all we have to check is the value of that Boolean, because that Boolean in and of itself will evaluate to true or false. So if it evaluates to true, we'll output this message. Otherwise, we'll output this message.